morning, everyone. My name is Kate, and I'm a financial technology advisor here at Hyperbots. Today, I'm delighted to have Claudia Mejia as my guest. Hello, Claudia. How are you doing?
Hi, Kate. How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm doing great. Nice to see you too. Claudia is the managing director at Ikigai Edge Consulting. Today, we will be discussing handling tax liability for undercharged sales tax invoice. So, coming to the first question, what should a company's first step be if a vendor charges less tax than required?
So, the first step will be to determine who is responsible for paying the tax, right? In most cases, it's the vendor, the one who is responsible. Therefore, ideally, you should contact the vendor and inform them about the undercharge and ask to the invoice to be corrected. That's the cleanest way to handle those kinds of errors to ensure compliance. So, for example, you receive the invoice that's supposed to be 7%, but you receive it with 5%. You just call them, advise them to review the invoice. And that's probably the cleanest way.
Understood. Moving on, why is it usually best to ask the vendor to issue a corrected invoice rather than paying the deficit directly to the state?
Well, that basically ensures that the vendor handles the tax obligations correctly and accurate. It's about making sure the compliance and the auditors can follow these transactions in an easier way. So if an invoice is done incorrectly from a tax point of view, a corrected action will be to call the vendor, making sure that is corrected, and then that way both parties have the right information for tax obligations.
That is a solid approach. So, if the vendor is unwilling or unable to issue a corrected invoice, what should the company do next?
So the company should self-assess the difference of the undercharge, and they can actually pay the tax directly to the state as a use tax. So basically, that's a mechanism that the buyer can self-assess these tax obligations and making sure that they pay to the state properly and the records are consistent with the tax obligations.
That does make a lot of sense. Claudia, could you explain what use tax is and why it might be necessary in cases of undercharged sales tax?
So, like we mentioned, the vendor is usually the ones who collects the tax and made the payments to the state. But if the vendor, for whatever reason, they are not going to reissue the invoice, the buyer has the capability to pay that directly to the state. So use tax is basically that tax that is paid directly from the buyer to the state, even though the vendor didn't collect it properly. So, for example, I am a buyer that I am in New York, but I bought supplies in out of the state, and they didn't charge me the proper tax or zero tax. So, me as buyer, I can go and pay directly to the state of New York that percentage that was not collected by the vendor.
I understand. Moving on, why is it important to document communication with the vendor and use any tax payments made to the state?
Well, the most important part in any financial records is to make sure that we are compliant, right? Every company follows the audit. For audit purposes, we need to make sure that those transactions are recorded properly. So when you have the documentation of all the taxes for each transaction or any other charges that you have that you have not been able to get properly, then by documenting those payments to the state, you basically proactively working to ensure compliance. So it's always making sure that your books are clean, that your cash flow is clean, and get very financial sound transactions.
I agree with you completely, Claudia. We have reached almost the end of our discussion today. So, the last question is, what is the best long-term approach if undercharging becomes a recurring issue with a vendor?
Well, like I said, if you are proactive with this type of always getting ahead of the transactions, right? You can review the invoices, you can make sure that the rates are in compliance with the state. With that in mind, when you're reviewing your invoices, if you are being undercharged, you follow the processes. You contact the vendor. You ask for an invoice that is corrected. If that does not happen, then you need to make sure that you follow through with the use tax and pay it directly. So just making sure that you have a very sound process, that you don't miss these errors. And at the end of the day, you are compliant with the state, you are compliant with your financial records pretty much, and it creates a cycle of self-control.
You're right, and that was a really interesting point. Thank you so much, Claudia, for your time and insights, and a big thanks to our listeners. I'll see you next time. Have a great
Thank
day.
you, Kate.